Hammurabi, the sixth king of Babylon, who ruled from around 1792 to 1750 BC, and was behind uniting much of Mesopotamia and turning Babylon into a major power. Yet he's best known for creating one of the world's earliest and most famous legal codes, the Code of Hammurabi. This set of nearly 300 laws was carved into a tall stone stele and placed in public, promoting the idea that justice should be consistent and accessible. The code covered everything from trade and property to marriage and crime, and famously using the principle an eye for an eye. Now, by today's standards, it's quite easy to suggest that Hammurabi was overzealous with the punishments aligned with his laws. So, for example, violent punishments, or even death, for non-violent crimes. And punishment also depended on who was wronged. So, as a basic example, let's say you purposely poked out the eye of a slave. And you were found guilty. Well, because he or she was a slave, then you'd only have to pay a fine for that. Because, back then slaves were considered subhuman. However, if you did the same thing to a nobleman, poked out his eye, then you would have your eye poked out in return. So despite the unfairness of punishments based on social class, there's no doubting that these rudimentary laws did bring order and justice to society. Hammurabi was also a very religious man, and he believed that the gods had power over people and events. And a popular practice for divine judgment was when an accused person, seeking to clear themselves of a crime, were asked to jump into the Euphrates River. If they sank, in other words drowned, then the person who'd accused him of the crime would be given the victim's house as a reward for their successful input. However, if the accused didn't drown, so basically they made it to shore, that's different. He was then cleared of the crime. Yes! And as for the individual who'd pointed the finger at him, well, they were subsequently put to death. I suppose that's fair enough. Of course, this was a time when very few people were able to swim, so it's safe to assume the gods were busier with their guilty verdicts. Hammurabi's legacy lives on as a symbol of early legal thought and governance. And quite possibly, he also helped develop the push for the very first swimming lessons in history. Ashurnasirpal, a powerful king of Assyria who ruled from 883 to 859 BC. He's remembered for his military conquests, administrative reforms, and monumental building projects. He also developed a more centralized and efficient government, laying the foundations for future Assyrian power. But of course, being an ancient ruler meant that he was also a complete and utter nutcase. Expanding Assyrian control through brutal campaigns across Mesopotamia, using fear and psychological warfare to maintain dominance, and he often recorded this in quite some graphic detail. In one particular monument inscription, it recalls the following: "Their men, young and old, I took prisoners. Of some I cut off their feet and hands. Of others I cut off their ears, noses, and lips. Of the young men's ears I made a heap." And it goes on, blood, death, etc., etc., harping on about how brutal he is. Like some kind of sadistic show-off, essentially. However, putting aside this unashamed brutality, he also built a grand palace decorated with intricate reliefs that still awe historians today. These artworks, along with their inscriptions, provide a vivid picture of his reign. Ashurnasirpal II. Although there's no doubting that he was a boastful psychopath, he was also a master strategist. And his reign marked the rise of Assyria as a major empire. Sennacherib was a powerful king of Assyria who ruled from 705 to 681 BC. He's best known for his military campaigns, especially his brutal siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC. which is famously described in both Assyrian records and the Bible. And actually in the Old Testament, he's considered just a bit of a git. He claimed victory over Jerusalem, even though he didn't actually conquer and get inside the city walls, which is something that modern-day historians are still debating. So what was the reason why Sennacherib couldn't get into Jerusalem? Well, the Bible suggests that a miracle saved Jerusalem, no less. Yes. Apparently, an angel came down from the heavens and killed all 185,000 of Sennacherib's soldiers. Sort of a holy hitman? However, legendary ancient Greek historian Herodotus had a slightly different take on the matter, believing that the soldiers had been overrun with mice during a campaign in Egypt and had caught some sort of disease. And this theory was picked up again in the 20th century by biblical scholar John Bright, who also suggested that an epidemic, perhaps something like the bubonic plague, had run through Sennacherib's army. Sennacherib's reign was marked by ambition, innovation, and of course, a fair amount of cruelty. And ultimately, it wasn't going to end well for him. His eldest son, Ardashir, held the position of heir apparent until 684 BC, when Sennacherib suddenly replaced him with his younger brother, Esarhaddon. And yeah, that didn't go down too well with Ardashir, especially when inscriptions from the time claim it was all because Daddy was a little bit disappointed in him. And so, as if straight off the pages of a Hollywood movie script, Ardashir assassinated his father in one of the sacred temples of Nineveh. Sennacherib. Although he was never going to win a Dad of the Year award, he's nonetheless one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of the ancient Near East. Ashurbanipal was one of the last great kings of the Assyrian Empire, ruling from 669 to around 631 BC. Known for both his military strength and intellectual pursuits, he expanded the empire to its greatest extent, conquering Egypt and crushing rebellions with ruthless efficiency. But Ashurbanipal wasn't just a warrior, he was also a scholar. He built the famous library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, which housed thousands of clay tablets and is considered the first systematically organized library in history. Shh. Much of what we know about Mesopotamian literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, survives because of his collection. His reign marked the height of Assyrian power, and according to a tablet unearthed in 1854 by Austin Henry Layard in Nineveh, apparently Ashurbanipal sent his entire army to crush the Elamites. Let's just say that these two Mesopotamian groups hadn't really seen eye to eye for centuries. And so, Ashurbanipal's army attacked the city of Susa, in what today modern scholars consider as a genocide. And even though the Assyrians went home victorious, after years of war they had destroyed their own ability to defend themselves. Soon after, Ashurbanipal was struck down with disease, and a few years later he died. And with him, also the Assyrian Empire, soon to be replaced by another legendary power of ancient times, the Babylon dynasty. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, and the world's first ever librarian. Shh. Nebuchadnezzar II, the greatest king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, ruling from 605 to 562 BC. A brilliant builder, Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, with towering walls, grand temples, and the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though their existence is still debated. He saw himself as both a warrior and a patron of culture, restoring old temples and promoting Babylonian religion and identity. But of course, when the warrior side did take over, he would then become an absolute fruitcake. He's best known for his military conquests, especially the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and the exile of the Jewish population to Babylon. hence why he's one of the biggest villains featured in the Hebrew Old Testament. In fact, the Judean exile and the impact it had on them is captured in the opening lines of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, when we remembered Zion. And amazingly, some more context was provided to this large-scale exile during an archaeological dig in the early 20th century. Excavating beneath the ruins of an ancient Babylonian palace, archaeologists found 14 vaulted rooms. At first, they thought that they'd actually discovered the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, but as it turned out, it was actually nothing more than a royal storehouse. So it was a bit of a letdown. However, they did nevertheless stumble across some really interesting pieces, and among them was a 3-inch tall fragment containing the name Jehoiachin, King of Judah. The fragment turned out to be part of a ration list, indicating how much oil and foodstuffs were given to King Jehoiachin and his exiled Judean court in Babylon. As Eckhart Fromm, a professor of Near Eastern languages and civilizations at Yale University, puts it, it was a remarkable find, and proof of the Babylonians' ruthless nature. The Bible also gives special mention to Nebuchadnezzar, claiming that he went mad and spent 7 years crawling around naked and chewing grass in the wilderness. But most modern-day scholars believe this was just a fictional story that has been made up because he was just so despised. However, a bit of a strange twist. According to Eckhart Fromm, Babylonian texts do actually recall the story of a mad king called Nabonidus, who ruled 2 decades after Nebuchadnezzar, and he ended up losing the Babylonian Empire to the Persians. Nebuchadnezzar. Yes, he did play the biblical bad guy role with aplomb, but actually his reign marked a golden age for Babylon, making him one of the most iconic and powerful rulers of the ancient Near East.